Welcome back, guys. And here goes chapter 2. 8-year-old Abby McNeil fell sick in late September and missed an entire week of third grade at the newly opened Thornburn Public Elementary School. Whether the illness was viral in origin or the result of sustained exhaustion was never diagnosed, because her father maintained a basic mistrust of doctors. A hostile orthopedist had once testified against him in a workman's comp claim, and an even baser discomfort with clinics. The only people who went to clinics, he often said, were poor blacks looking for free birth control and Portuguese factory workers with gonorrhea. And so Abby lay in bed that first Monday morning following another weekend of feverish nightmares beneath the critical eye of her father, until he rendered his diagnosis. "You're sick. You should stay home. But if you're screwing around with me, girl, you're going to get a beating." With those words, he left her alone for the morning while he went downtown to get his unemployment check. He returned at lunchtime with a bottle of NyQuil and a thermometer he'd purchased at the CVS. The little girl was running a temperature of 102 by then and had become dehydrated. After she'd choked down the vicious adult flu medicine and some tepid tap water, she dropped off into a feverish delirium. Sunlight climbed the faded wallpaper before reddening, dying, and succumbing to the time-lapse shadows. Around 7 that evening, on his way out to the tap room, her father paused in her doorway, frowning at the sight of his daughter in the grip of sickness. Fetal, sheets kicked off her flushed young body, her breathing quick and hot. Something bothered him about the sight of her, beyond the fever itself, and kept him on the threshold of the sick room. Something wrong with the way the shadows seemed to cling to her sweat-sheened limbs. Something wrong about the limbs themselves. She looked longer. Was it a trick of the dying light, or could he see the teenager she would become already showing herself lightly beneath this child's skin? And yet she was sucking on the 2 long middle fingers of her right hand, an infantile reflex. He'd never seen her do that before, not even when she was an infant. He left hastily. By the next day the fever had broken, though Abby's horrible body aches kept her home from school yet again. Out her bedroom window she could hear her school bus rumbling by, and she was sure she could even distinguish the individual voices of her friends. Her hearing was getting sharper. She could hear mice in the basement. She could hear voices in the current of the wall sockets. Later that morning, the man her father had hired came to begin work on the ceiling over Abby's bedroom, so she moved her convalescence to the sofa downstairs in front of the TV. The repairman, he introduced himself to Abby simply as Paul, seemed surprised to learn her father had left her alone in the house. She'd let him in to use the bathroom when he appeared at the back screen door. "Do you need anything? Some water or something?" he asked when he came back from the bathroom. She shook her head. "Do you have a little girl?" Abby asked him suddenly. A little. Her eyes seemed strangely older than her years, heavy with sad understanding. "No, not yet. Soon." Abby nodded gravely and returned her attention to the television. He felt with certainty that he'd been dismissed, and yet he lingered a moment before returning to work. He searched for a business card in his shirt pocket and handed it to Abby. "Do you know how to use a telephone?" he asked her. Abby turned those 2 wise eyes to him with a pitying look. "Are you kidding?" she asked. "Right. Dumb question," Paul said. "Well, if you need anything while your dad's out and I'm up on the roof, you just call this number. I carry my cell phone with me." He slapped his hip where the cell phone was clipped beside a tape measure, a pocket knife, and a pager. Then he left the little girl staring blankly at the flickering television. By noon, Abby had grown bored with Nickelodeon reruns, Gilligan's Island, Brady Bunch, McHale's Navy, Partridge Family. After Bewitched, she pulled on her best school clothes and quietly ventured outside for the first time since falling ill. She was shaky, unstable on her aching legs, but she couldn't bear to remain cooped up in the house a moment longer. Outside on the porch, Abby sat on the steps and tried looking up at the blue sky, streaked with the cottony contrails of long-gone airplanes. But it was too penetratingly blue for her tender eyes, and she had to look away. She felt hot, flush in the face, as if the fever might be returning. Her eyes found the inviting shade of the woods beyond, at the edge of the weedy lot behind their yard. The woods looked cool and peaceful, back where the details of individual trees melted into a deep and leafy blur. Abby stood and decided, on impulse, to seek refuge in its shade. She slipped her bare feet into the dusty pink jellies she left beside the screen door, her summer play shoes, and strode off purposefully across the yard, stepping without hesitation beyond its mowed border into the waiting field of tall weeds and witchgrass. Without a backward glance, she disappeared into the shade of the woods. A child left alone outdoors long enough will always find her way to water. Minutes after she'd entered the canopy of shady woods, Abby discovered a creek, a tributary from some unseen spring. It babbled gently over mossy rocks that were green above the waterline, cool and slimy below. She followed the water to a kind of tide pool and watched a water bug skating across the placid surface, its legs barely dimpling the water. She found a school of minnows hovering in the shadows by a muddy bank. She investigated a shoal of fragile foam beside decomposing leaves. The creek fascinated her for an hour and led her deeper within the woods. When she finally looked up from her investigations, she found herself in an unfamiliar clearing. She was alone and, she supposed, lost. She wasn't afraid yet, though. Shafts of sunlight angled down through breaks in the high canopy above. She found a fallen tree that crumbled beneath her weight when she tried to climb up onto it. Inside it was dry and rotten, roiling with termites. She ventured farther into the clearing. The trees here seemed different from the others in the woods. They were thicker, which meant, recalling a life sciences project in the second grade, they were older. If you cut one in half, it would have many rings, one for each year. These trees must be very old, and like old people, they were twisted and bent, barnacled with strange misshapen growths and burled, tumorous swellings. Their bark was mottled, scarred, split in places to reveal raw, sodden wood beneath. One trunk bore great fatty lobes of fungus. Another wept a treacly black sap. All rose up from visible roots that clutched the moist humus of the forest floor like arthritic hands. Abby realized the clearing had fallen strangely silent, like a church. Gone were the bird calls, the ever-present susurrus of insects. No more breeze in tree branches overhead, or the distant rumble of airplanes. But Abby still wasn't afraid. She was curious. And when she found the gravestones, she ceased to be simply a visitor to this place. She knew she'd found a home. They lay in a tumbled heap, 3 stones so old they almost seemed natural to rock. Abby kneeled down to peer at the first name carved into the green face of the first stone. She read the letters eroded by 300 seasons of wind, rain, and snow. Sarah Hutchins, condemned witch, hanged this day, 1699. She had to read the words slowly, sounding them out. She traced a fingertip through the shallow grooves, feeling each letter, quietly with reverence. The woods watched. The trees held their breath, as if afraid to startle away the timid visitor to this secret place. But Abby felt no impulse to flee this quiet place. Just the opposite, in fact. She'd found a new secret place of her own. Wendy was late for work. She turned onto Thurgey Avenue, which was part of the sleepy business district located within 3 miles of the main Danford campus. The Crystal Path was nestled within a block of 9 quaint shops, painted in different pastel flavors, each one sporting a gingerbread trim of awning and an old-world charm that made you want to tack "ye old" to the front of every store's name. The store tenants had unilaterally agreed that street parking be reserved for customers, so Wendy was spared the embarrassment of parallel parking the Gremlin, which she found to be a nightmare even when the little car cooperated by not conking out on her. The long, narrow lot behind the row of stores handled the spillover customers and employees. Just her dumb luck to get stuck in the spot next to the big, smelly dumpster. Wendy opened the door to the tinkling sound of hanging silver chimes in the shape of quarter moons and stars. Alyssa hated buzzers and the pleasant aroma of a vanilla candle. As always, just walking through the door of the place seemed to soothe Wendy. "I'm sorry, Alyssa," Wendy called instinctively. Her boss was often in the back of the store practicing her yoga breathing or postures, even when she was technically in charge of the register. In other words, when she was alone in the store. Her regulars usually browsed for a while before requiring any sort of sales assistance. Newcomers were often at a loss as to what to make of the shop anyway and needed time alone to acclimate. "Wendy, is that you?" "Reporting for duty," Wendy called back to the back of the store. While she was alone, she took a moment to look at the store anew, as she imagined a first-time visitor would see it. Arranged around the front of the store were jars and baskets of daisies, lavender, jasmine, and roses, some fresh, some dried. Various handmade jewelry items, mostly crystal or silver, were on display in the glass cases that formed the cash register's U. At each corner of the island stood an oversized palmistry model hand, with all the lines and whorls of the palm reader's art plainly illustrated and labeled. Each hand was suction cupped to the smooth glass countertop. On the walls on either side of the register were shelves featuring crystal balls and polished stones, including amethyst, blue-laced agate, sapphire, tiger eye, and rutilated quartz. Farther back on the left side were the many jars of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, sage, and hawthorn among them. Opposite this display were drawers of muslin bags, candles of numerous sizes and shapes, empty bottles and jars, and decorative baskets, shelves with simple and elaborate candle holders, wooden mortars and pestles, and even an assortment of tarot decks. Wendy stepped inside the cash register U and high-fived the nearest palmistry hand, smiling as it wobbled back and forth like one of those inflatable punch clowns that always came back for more. She tossed her backpack on a low shelf under the register. Alyssa didn't mind if she caught up on her class assignments if business was slow, as long as the store was properly presented, swept, watered, dusted, folded, and alphabetized. "Traffic bad?" Wendy spun around to face Alyssa Raines, who had a disconcerting habit of gliding wraith-like throughout the shop, making about as much noise as a passing thought. "Traffic bad, Gremlin worse." Alyssa had an ethereal presence and an inner tranquility about her. A youthful face with hauntingly pale blue eyes framed by long white hair, usually bound in a loose ponytail. Since she'd taken up yoga, she more than often not wore flowery scarves and wrap-around skirts over her exercise leotard. She kept an exercise mat in the back room, along with her own personal mandala, so she liked to be able to strip down quickly to her leotard for a 20 or 30-minute yoga session. "Gwendolyn, I do believe that car is the only thing blocking you from true inner peace." Whether consciously or unconsciously, Alyssa always seemed to use Wendy's formal name when she was in mentor mode. "I know," Wendy said, chagrined. "More trouble than it's usually worth." Why not get a bike? A good 10-speed could get you around campus and back and forth to work easily enough. I need a place for all my stuff, Wendy said sheepishly. Besides, Wendy thought, I already have a bike. It's up on blocks in my bedroom. Most of your stuff is trash you forgot to throw away. You know, we do have recycling bins in back. Wendy nodded. She planned to get organized just as soon as she got some free time. So, how's business today? Wendy asked. Change of topic. Okay, I can take a hint. Business? Well, you know what I always say. We only get two types of customers. Tourists and true believers. Well, the tourists are scarce today, and the true believers must be all stocked up, Alyssa said with a wry smile. What do you want me to do? Got in a shipment of books. Alyssa tapped a large brown box with the toe of a slipper. Shelve those, give the place the once-over with the magic duster, and you're free to crack open the books for the rest of the evening. Oh, joy, Wendy said with a wry smile. If you need me, I'll be in back for a little pranayama. Breathing exercises. Wendy was starting to remember all the annas and amas of yoga. She took the box of clutter out of the drawer and sliced the top of the book carton open. She made 3 trips to the back of the store, stacking the books in a loose pile on the floor. All the books were shelved by topic, not by author, so when she got to the book on water dowsing, she had to decide whether to file it in the W section for water or in the D for dowsing. She settled on D, since that was more specific. Sitting on the carpeted floor with no customers to help, no sounds but her own humming to intrude, she felt a creeping lethargy seep into her bones, as if she were being pulled down into sleep by a strong hand. She yawned so wide her jaw cracked. After she shelved these books, she had a whole pile of her own textbooks to absorb. Another yawn. Oh boy, she mumbled through the hand pressed to her mouth. It's going to be a long evening. After a full afternoon of classes and 1 graduate seminar, Proust, Joyce, Faulkner, Architects of Memory, Karen was exhausted. Driving home in her red Volvo, she wanted nothing more than a cool drink, a magazine, and a few uninterrupted hours on the porch glider before sunset. Alas, her evening wind-down wasn't to be. As she turned off Main onto Lore Avenue, she saw Paul Leeson's blue pickup parked outside her house and the man himself taking measurements on the wraparound porch. Karen sighed and told herself she should be glad to see him. Like many a successful contractor, he juggled her renovation along with half a dozen others, assigning priority to the homeowners who shouted loudest when he went MIA for more than a day. Too often, Karen found herself low on that priority list. Paul looked up at the sound of the Volvo's tires on the gravel driveway and raised a hand in a kind of minimalist wave. He was a plain-featured man, always just shy of a sunburn, and handsome if you caught him in the right kind of light. This kind, in fact. A 6:30 sun. He wore contractor's standard-issue jeans. He kept a pair of pressed khakis for delivering an estimate, but somewhat uncharacteristically favored old golf shirts in wash-faded pastels, monogrammed with little alligators or polo players. Sometimes Karen thought he looked more like a golf pro, up there on his A-frame ladder, than a general contractor. "Need help?" he called as she lifted a stack of blue exam books from the passenger seat of the Volvo. She shook him off, but he came anyway, closing the Volvo's door for her, taking her shoulder bag from her. "Did I catch you actually planning to do some work?" she asked, tempering the jab with a smile. "You feeling neglected?" he asked. "Just cranky," she said. "Been a long day. My feet hurt. My back hurts. The baby's been doing jumping jacks all afternoon." They climbed the porch steps, Karen throwing a forlorn glance at her antique glider. Paul had laden it with tools. "We've got to talk about the bills, Professor Glazer," he said as he held open the screen door for her. She was singling out her house key, trying not to lose the slumping stack of exam books. "Oh, yeah? I'm afraid I can't do any more work until you settle some outstanding receipts. How would you like to pay?" "Inside," she said, pushing the heavy door open. He followed her into the cool foyer, the place smelling comfortingly old, like carpets and deep closets. Part of the reason Karen had fallen in love with it. She turned within the sudden circle of his arms and kissed him. She felt his 5 o'clock shadow, like fine grit sandpaper, though with his fair hair the stubble wouldn't be visible for hours. She fumbled behind her to close the door on their little display. He broke the kiss and gave her an amused look. "Don't want the neighbors to know you're carrying on with the handyman?" "Just chilly." "Bullshit," he said, not unpleasantly. She slipped away from him and into the living room. Long streaks of honeyed sunlight lay across the oriental carpet, the only time of day the sun was low enough to breach the ramparts of the deep porch. Karen dropped the exam books on the piano bench, tossed her keys into the basket atop the old spinet. Paul slipped a hand across her belly as she flipped through the day's mail. She asked him without looking up, "Do I really owe you money?" He grunted and said, "1,500. His touch turning into a caress. "That much?" "It's the cedar siding. Expensive stuff, particularly for the quality you want." She'd returned her attention to the mail, using her finger like a letter opener. He took advantage of the moment's distraction to slip beneath her radar. "You know, there's a simple way we could economize." She was only half listening. He felt like a shrink planting a post-hypnotic suggestion. "I could put my place up for sale, move in here. We turn my mortgage payments into your renovations." He nuzzled her throat, slipping his arms around from behind. She sighed. "Paul." "Don't worry, Professor. It's not a marriage proposal." She turned to face him. "But it's not a good idea either." She tried to say it gently, but he darkened nonetheless. "Why?" She headed into the kitchen. He followed on her heels. "I'm just beginning to get used to this being my place," she said. Her parents had deeded it to her when they moved to Panama City. Paul trapped her in the corner where the kitchen counters met. "Okay, so it's your place." He touched her belly. "But this is our daughter." She looked away. She hadn't yet gotten used to thinking of the baby as theirs together. In unguarded moments, she still found herself thinking of the unborn child as somehow a solo act of creation. Ridiculous, she knew, and usually checked herself for thinking it. But even quashed, the thought left an aftertaste of possessiveness, and Paul sensed it. "She is going to be our daughter, isn't she?" he asked. "Or am I overstaying my welcome?" "Of course not." She flashed an irritated look, forcing him to let her out of the corner. Went to the fridge and began rooting around inside, improvising supper. "Honestly, Paul, I think sometimes you wait to spring this shit on me when I'm at peak exhaustion. It's like you know my resistance is weak." "Trouble sleeping again?" It was more observation than question. "Bad dreams." "No kidding," he said, and she saw the worry etched around his eyes. Good, kind Paul Leeson. Nothing duplicitous about this man. Nothing hesitant or uncertain about his feelings for her. He deserved no less in return, and once more Karen felt ashamed she couldn't return his love without qualification. "You were talking in your sleep again last night," he said, taking a beer for himself from the door of the fridge and twisting off the cap with a calloused palm. "Anything memorable?" "You called me a son of a whore at one point," he said, and took a meditative swallow of beer. He wiped his frothy lips and belched quietly. "Oh, yeah, and a pig fucker. I sort of liked that one." She looked troubled. "I'm sure I wasn't talking to you." "Who then? Department chair?" She looked up at him, concerned. "I don't remember," she said, finally finding it easier to lie. For, in fact, she did remember, if not the name, then certainly the face. The particulars had evaporated in daylight, but the man's hard, flinty face remained, seared like a phosphor flash afterimage on her retinas. Her accuser. Let me guess, Art speculated later that evening, as he and Karen and his brother Paul lingered over coffee on the front porch of 131 Lore. You're teaching Seven Gables again. Couple that with new parent anxiety. What you have is a recipe for a nightmare in the shape of 17th century Wendell. The sun had just slipped beyond the western rim of the world, setting ablaze the century-old textile mills that loomed there in stark relief against the smoldering sky. Night was coming on from the east, bringing with it its first scatter of stars and early rumor of winter. If Halloween had a smell, and it did to those inclined to remember it, then tonight smelled prematurely of that holiday, still a long month away. I hope that's all it is, Karen murmured absently. Paul lit a cigarette and aimed his smoke out at the night, away from the porch. So what are you going to do now that they rejected your dissertation? He asked Art. I don't know. I'm appealing the board's decision, but it's probably a lost cause. Paul nodded once. You could always come work with me. A beat of surprise, and Art gave an involuntary laugh. Working for you, you mean? Hear me out. I've been giving this some thought, Paul said, raising a hand. With you on board, we could go after some of the choice historic renovation projects in Essex County. You've been researching this town's history for the past 14 years, Art. Right now, I'm just Paul Leeson, general contractor. We team up, suddenly we're Leeson Brothers, preservationists. Art smiled, touched. Even as a kid, Paul had always tried to remedy any and all family disharmony. We'd be more convincing if I had my Ph.D., Art said, which was the only way that occurred to him at the moment to sidestep his brother's offer without hurting his feelings. Karen said, Why don't you come up with a new dissertation topic, one that salvages as much of your existing research as possible, but gives it a sexier spin? Sexier? How? She gave Art a pitying look. You're really clueless about academia, aren't you? He flashed her a helpless look, and she gave him a crash course. Okay, who chairs the history department? Lee Himes? She's pretty well known in her field, actually. Danfield's lucky to have gotten her. She's published pioneering social histories of women during the Industrial Revolution and the Second World War. Now take a look at the faculty who've been granted tenure since she took over as chair, Karen said, and began ticking them off on her fingers. Weber, Getty, Olson. What do they have in common? They're all women, Art said. Wait a minute, Paul said, looking surprised. Is that legal? Karen shot him an amused look and simply said, We've come a long way, baby. She turned back to Art. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting Lee Himes has been denying any male faculty advancements solely on the basis of gender. After all, she hired 2 new adjunct professors this year and approved tenure for a third, all men. But it's naive to ignore the fact that Danfield's history department has become a feminist enclave. If you think that's unfair, you can go apply to another program with a bias more to your liking, or you can put a spin on your research that will appeal to the current powers that be. You mean like women of the textile mills of Essex County? Karen stood, began gathering their empty coffee mugs and dessert dishes. I would think you could recycle whole chapters of your old dissertation. Art was getting excited now. Christ, it's all there already. I'd have to do a little more research, of course, and probably a year's worth of writing, but you're welcome, Karen said, opening the screen door with her elbow and carrying the ceramic mugs inside. Let me help you with those, Art said, following Karen through the screen door. He gestured for his brother to stay. Finish your cigarette. I'll help with the dishes. Inside, Art joined Karen at the kitchen sink, drying the dishes she handed him. He talked excitedly for the next 10 minutes about how he could recast his dissertation. He realized she was only half listening. She'd slipped away again into her own dark thoughts and was washing each dish mechanically, scrubbing it long past clean. Lost in the rush of the tap, the slosh of water. Art watched her furtively, taking advantage of her inattention. She was wearing a light wool cardigan, and each time her sweater shoulder brushed against his, he experienced an almost static electric charge. Their soapy hands touched as they exchanged a plate. He knew Karen was aware of his crush on her, which had first bloomed in high school, and he was pretty sure she was flattered. That's what had kept it innocent all these years, and somehow permissible. It was a secret they maintained together, like a balloon kept sweetly aloft on the thermals of mutual affection. Only in Art's blackest periods, and in close quarters moments like this, did it become nearly unbearable. "Do you want to talk about those dreams you're having?" Art said now, paying special care not to drop the porcelain creamer he was attempting to dry. "It's okay, Art," she said. "I'm fine. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. You know, just random neurons firing. Or some side effect of all the hormones you've got sloshing through your—" He noticed then that she was crying, silently. He stood helpless, drying his hands so he could put an arm around her shaking shoulder. The tears stopped coming, but he felt a tremor shiver through her as she pressed herself against the edge of the sink. "I'm afraid, Art," she said, her voice blurry with tears. She was trying to be quiet, so Paul wouldn't hear. "Something's wrong. With the baby. I don't know what exactly." "Have you talked to your doctor? What does Paul say?" "They think I'm paranoid, that I'm just stressing because I'm having a baby at 38. "Are you?" he asked gently. "No, not any more than any pushing 40 mother-to-be would. And all the early tests show the baby is normal." She nodded in the direction of the ultrasound stuck by a magnet to the refrigerator door. She snatched a paper towel from the dispenser over the sink and blotted her eyes. "I just have this terrible feeling, like a sixth sense." She wadded the paper towel into a ball, angry at herself for crying. Art's arm was still around her. He felt a momentary twinge of guilt that he was here with his arm around Karen while Paul was outside, but that was quickly replaced by a deeper satisfaction that he could somehow provide a comfort his brother could not. Karen was looking at the windows above the sink, which had darkened to the point that they'd become mirrors of the kitchen. They reflected back at her the haunted image of her own face, missing its eyes. "Something's wrong," Karen said, as much to herself as Art. "Something's wrong with my baby, and my dreams are trying to tell me." Night. The woods rustled quietly, the trees whispering to one another as if afraid to wake the child sleeping in their midst, sleeping sweetly upon a bed of moss and composted leaves, with a gravestone for her headboard. Abby dreamed. She is Sarah Hutchins and stands across a long table from her husband. Roland Hutchins is much older, but powerfully built through his shoulder and arms. He is eating meat off a wooden trencher with his hands. He struggles to get comfortable in his banister-backed chair, but it creaks beneath him with each movement. He curses, stands, and kicks the chair across the room. "Useless!" he shouts, then glares at her, and it's apparent he's not commenting on just the chair. Sarah says nothing. Instead, she looks down to avoid his angry eyes. He sits at the long bench, moving his meal and tankard of beer with him. He chews his last piece of meat lustily, then wipes his hands on a linen napkin. "More meat," he says, breaking off a hunk of bread from a loaf in the middle of the table. "Too hard," he mutters with a disgusted shake of his head. He washes down the bread with a mouthful of beer. "You are a failure as a wife. Where's my meat, woman?" She hurries to the stew pot in the center of the table, attempts to ladle more meat onto the trencher, but her hand is trembling. His eyes glare into her, and she shudders, splashing hot gravy on his hand. His face goes white in an instant. Her hand recoils from her mistake, and the back of her hand spills the tankard of beer across the table. She gasps, hands pressed her to her face, fingers splayed across her mouth. I beg for forgiveness, husband." "Can you do nothing right?" He is rising from the bench, shaking hot gravy from his large hand. She stands on the other side of the table, unable to move. "I pray forgiveness." He slowly comes around the table, his face a leering mask. As he flashes a wicked smile, she drops the ladle at her feet. He enjoys her fear as much as his power over her. "I am done forgiving," he says. 14 years old and never learned the simplest of lessons." She wants to run, to hide, to huddle in a corner. Her legs tremble, but her feet seem glued to the floor. She cannot move. He is now on her side of the table, towering over her, the stink of his sweat and overpowering odor. He shows her the gravy on his hand. "See that?" he asks her. She gulps, nods quickly, acknowledging her mistake, but it will do no good. There will be no clemency. His arm is a blur as he backhands her across the face with his soiled hand. She crumples to the floor, her hand clamping over her cheek, now smeared with his gravy and the blood from her split lip. He reaches down, clamps his hand around her upper arm, and lifts her to her feet. Too unsteady to stand on her own, she merely sags against him, silent tears trickling down her face. If she sobs, it will be worse, much worse. Asleep on the grave, Abby whimpers softly, pulling her arm from an invisible grip. He shakes his head again, looking at her coldly. "Perhaps a good beating will remind you of your duties," he bellows. Just then a knock, 3 quick raps on the keeping room floor. "Who comes at this hour?" Roland asks, his voice uncertain. He stands and faces the door, and the dark he knows waits beyond. Behind him, Sarah scrambles to her feet, brushing at her petticoat. The flames in the wall sconces gutter. An unseen hand moves the door latch, and the door swings inward. She stands there, cloaked in shadows, but her face is pale and her eyes reflect the candlelight and blaze toward him. "I would speak with your kind wife." Roland stands slack-jawed before her, the fire of his rage snuffed out. Sarah notices his hands twitch slightly as he says, Good evening, Widow Wither." Wither says, "Good evening," Wendy said, snapping awake from her sitting position on the floor, disoriented. She looked around, realized she had been leaning against the wall of New Age wisdom, the concentric swirls of the mandalas above looking like a hypnotist's tools. The crystal path, of course. She had been working. "Who are you talking to?" Alyssa asked, standing over her with a curious smile. "I think I zoned out there for a minute." Wendy rubbed her face, sighed heavily. She stood, listened to her joints creaking and cracking in protest. "Zoned out?" Alyssa asked with a knowing smile. "All right, busted," Wendy said with a sheepish grin. "I dozed off for a minute or two. Honestly, I don't know why you even bothered to pay me at the end of the week." Alyssa massaged her shoulders. "You're still adjusting to your new schedule. College life, employment, and piles of homework. Give yourself time to adjust. But you must get your sleep, Gwendolyn. Sleep is essential." "I do sleep," Wendy said. She looked down. Somehow she had managed to shelve all the new books before nodding off. "But when I sleep, I dream, and—" She shuddered. "I have these nightmares." She walked toward the front of the store, subconsciously walking away from her problems, perhaps, or at least the discussion of them. Alyssa followed, relentless as usual. "What sort of dreams? Showing up in class naked? Taking a test you forgot to study for? Being chased, but your legs won't move fast enough?" "It's a little more involved than that," Wendy said. "Those are anxiety dreams. Consciously, you're worrying about something while, behind the scenes, your mind is trying to work it out." "I'm always worried about something," Wendy said with a quirk of her lips. "These dreams aren't even about me. They're about some other person, like I'm looking through her eyes." The door chimes tinkled, and a curly blonde strolled into the store, taking in the inventory with one wide, sweeping gaze. Frankie, what are you doing here? Wendy asked. I never forget a promise, Frankie said, and I promised to look this place up some night so that I could torment you at your place of employment. I think our dear Gwendolyn has quite enough tormenting her, Alyssa said, looking at Wendy. She missed Frankie mouthing Gwendolyn with her eyebrows arched impressively high. I'm Alyssa, Wendy's boss said. Pleasure to meet you. Cool store, Frankie replied. Thank you, Alyssa said, then turned back to Wendy. So let's hear about these dreams. It's always about the late 17th century, I think, Wendy said. Puritans. Frankie looked knowingly at Alyssa. You see, it figures. Talk about male-dominated oppression of women. You go back a few centuries and forget about it. We're talking about that now in my founding mothers class. Ignoring Frankie's commentary for the most part, Wendy sat down on the stool behind the cash register. It feels like I'm dreaming about events that really happened back then, Wendy said. In Wendell. This town certainly has a long history, Alyssa said. Maybe your college studies are filtering into your subconscious and giving you historical nightmares. What's happening in the dreams? Wendy frowned at her and said, Sometimes I'm flying over Wendell, how it must have looked back then. Houses made of squared timbers, a commons where livestock graze, a meeting house and church. Flying dreams? Frankie said. You're talking sexual repression there, sister. Alyssa frowned at her, and Frankie closed her mouth abruptly, making a key and lock gesture in front of her mouth. And there's this feeling of darkness and fear in the town. I feel like I'm watching over it, but I'm not afraid. I'm just watching, and there's this sense of purpose, of manipulation, like I might be the cause of the fear. I don't know. Does that make any sense? Frankie and Alyssa were staring at her, but she just shook her head, unwilling to say more. Alyssa spoke first. I still think these are anxiety dreams, Wendy. In Wendell, an interest in witchcraft, in white magic, isn't all that unusual, considering our town's heritage. But now that you are in college, you may be feeling the pressure of being different a little more strongly now. Maybe, Wendy conceded. One bit of advice, Alyssa added. No meditation. When you're dealing with negativity and self-image problems, avoid meditation. It is a way of concentrating the bad stuff. What you need is action, a way to work out those feelings without dwelling upon them. Or you might consider aromatherapy. I can give you the card of a good aromatherapist. She's a sweet little lady, and a good aromatherapy massage might be just the thing. Thanks, Wendy said. I'll think about it. But already Wendy was thinking along other lines. Anyway, I'll go back in and leave you two alone, Alyssa said, padding softly toward the back of the store, her skirt the merest whisper of fabric. Wendy grabbed the duster and came out from behind the cash register. Follow me, Wendy said. Nothing looks sadder than dusty crystal balls. Frankie looked around conspiratorially. So, Wendy, are you still planning on doing your ceremony thing out in the woods? Why not? Wendy asked defensively. I don't know, Frankie said. I'd be creeped out after having those dreams, that's all. I mean, sitting bare-ass naked out in the woods alone at night? She shivered. That's a very small part of it, actually, Wendy said. Just how did you get into this Wicca stuff anyway? Being born and raised in Wendell can do strange things to an impressionable young girl. But what really hooked me was this time in high school. A field trip. It was a science experiment where you made a ring out of a wire of clothes hanger and tossed it like a frisbee. You walked to where it landed and sketched whatever fell inside the boundaries of the ring. The idea was to identify whatever you happened to find by chance. But Wendy was getting bored with the plain old grass and rocks she kept finding within her ring, so she ventured far from the main group, deep into the surrounding woods, and found a small clearing that had an air of mystery about it. Wendy's hanger ricocheted off an ash tree, landing within a clump of red and white toadstools. She noted the tree and made her sketches. Later, her teacher identified the toadstools she'd drawn as fly agaric and told her that witches were said to use the hallucinogenic toadstools as an ingredient in the body grease that enabled them to fly. The hallucinogenic property might explain a lot of the myths. From her later reading, Wendy discovered that these witches made their broomsticks from the wood of ash trees. And that led me to Alyssa and this store where I've spent entirely too much money. I became an employee for the discounts, otherwise I'd be penniless. Frankie whispered, "You're telling me Alyssa sells these magic mushrooms? Too cool! I know a couple frat houses I'd like to buzz over." "Nothing hallucinogenic here, sorry," Wendy said, grinning. "But you don't really rub your body with these flying mushrooms, do you?" Frankie asked, wide-eyed. "Personally, no, I do not." A sudden image of flying filled Wendy's mind. She was looking down on log homes and the commons of colonial Wendell, on the sheep that darted and ran from the distorted moon shadow she cast upon the ground. Their primal fear filled her with a sense of power. Frankie was shaking her. Wendy shuddered. "Are you okay?" Frankie asked, her easy manner replaced with concern now. "I'm okay." "Could have fooled me," Frankie said. "You're white as a ghost." Wendy hid the trembling of her hands with quick passes of the duster. She forced a smile and a light tone as she said, "Maybe somebody walked on my grave." And we're going to take another little break while I get some more coffee, and I'll be right back.